week. I'll just say it that way. We'll get back to normal next week. But I thought I would take these 2 weeks that he was gone. He asked me to teach in here and talk about a few things in regard to, I guess you would say, evangelism, reaching out to folks who have not yet obeyed the gospel, or what we're going to talk about today is reaching out to those who have and have fallen away. So some more practical stuff today, I guess you might say. So some of the stuff we talked about last week just laid out some very straightforward biblical facts. People cannot be saved without hearing the gospel. And you know, we hear this I would call it, it's rather cliche. What does it mean when something is cliche? Well, it's true. It's been, what it means is it's been said so much that you don't even really think about what you're saying. It's a truth, but it's just it's almost like it's become an old fable because there's no, it's gotten to a point where there's no real thought behind it, things like this. So there's this old saying, this is the point I'm getting at, people would rather see a sermon than hear one any day. We've all heard that, right? You may be the only Bible somebody ever reads. Is that true? Can it be true that, well, maybe. People look at your life, if you're a Christian, and they're a non-Christian, and it may be the case that they know you're a Christian, and they are watching you intentionally to see how you conduct yourself. So in that sense, there is a little bit of truth to that. However, I think it is also the case that we as Christians, and I'm speaking generally here, maybe we lean on that a little too much. Why would it? Well, I'm not going to ask that yet. So, we talked about that. People cannot be saved without hearing the gospel. They can watch you live a good life all day long, but if they never hear the gospel, what good is that going to do? We talked about there will be people who will not listen. You may lose a friend. We talked about family connections that may get a little awkward. Relationships may get a little awkward. There are just some folks who don't want to hear the gospel. They don't want to be confronted with their own sin. Maybe that's another thing. There are some people in the world, and I'll say this, outside the church, yes, but also inside the church, which is what we're going to talk about more today, who they have no conception of self-examination. They can only see what everybody else is doing. And they're perfect. They may not think they're perfect, but they don't have anything to change. But they're sure quick to tell everybody else what they need to change. Well, and that's one thing they need to change, maybe. So, anyway. So we kind of ended last week talking, just laying out the case, laying out the fact that if a person has never obeyed the gospel, they are lost, period. And the New Testament uses that phrase, obey the gospel, 2 or 3 different times, and we looked at some of those last week, Romans 10, 2 Thessalonians 1. Of course, we looked at the rich man and Lazarus. When the rich man was in torment, he had a strong desire, didn't he? He wanted evangelism to be taking place then for his brothers. So let's start here. Take your Bibles to Matthew chapter 13. We didn't look at these passages last week, and I want to look at this today, and then we'll move on to some other thoughts. Matthew chapter 13. This is where Jesus starts teaching in parables, and there's a lot to be said from Matthew 13 about the church and about the importance of it. All right, somebody, if you would please, read Matthew 13, 18 through 23. Yeah, Matthew 18, 18 through 23. Matthew 13, 18 through 23. Okay, stop right there for just a second. I think one of the important things to notice about this parable is right there, what Reggie just read. Satan knows where the power is, doesn't he? You will notice it doesn't say they receive the word, or they hear the word of the kingdom, and then the devil comes and snatches away those good influences out of their life so they don't obey the gospel. That's not what it says, is it? Where's the power? Where's the power of salvation? According to that verse. What does he take away? The word. Okay? Keep reading. Okay, so we've read this parable before. This is some of the most basic teaching in all the New Testament, is these parables. Now, some of them are a little more complicated, yes, but you cannot get any more simple than this. The hearts, rather the soils, we know represents the heart, the different types of hearts that people have. So we already dealt with that first one. There are going to be some people that they're like the ground right along the roadside where people walk. It's just, there may not even be any grass there. It's just hard, compacted dirt. We know what that looks like. Some hearts are like that. Okay? But the power is still in the Word. And that's a key there in verse 19. Well, then you got folks who are compared to stony places. There's very little soil. The King James there at the end of verse 20 says, "And anon with joy receive it immediately." Okay, there's no depth there. It's just, "Ooh, this sounds good." And it's an immediate reaction to what they've heard, but, like I said in verse 21, there's no root, there's no depth of heart. And so if tribulation or persecution comes, and then notice again the emphasis here in verse 21. Why does the tribulation and persecution arise? Because of the Word. You've got then the thorns, which represents a heart that's just choked out. It's got too much other stuff to do, but then you've got the good heart. So that's the reality. The heart it's not your organ. It's your will, your intellect, your emotions. It's all of that, biblically speaking, typically. It's the seat of all that. So look down to Matthew 13. Okay, somebody read 47 through 50, please. Okay, 47 and 48 is the parable. 49 and 50 is the explanation. Have any of you ever done any cast net fishing? Anybody ever done that? That was a big thing in Pensacola where we came from. People would go out to the bay and they'd cast nets for mullet and whatever they could catch. And it's just, what gets in the net's what gets in the net, and that's what you bring to the shore. Well, that's much different than bait fishing, going to the river or a pond or something like that, and you have a very specific species you want to catch. Well, the point here is about the kingdom of heaven, spreading the net, spreading the gospel. You're going to attract all kinds of different fish, people. When's the division going to be made according to this parable? Look at verse 49. When will the final separation be made? At the end of the world. Okay? Now, does that mean, because I know how some people interpret that, does that mean that the church should not, that the church should tolerate sinful behavior and tolerate bad behavior? Because you know what? God will work it out all out in the end. We just need to tolerate everybody and everything. That's not what this parable's teaching here. So the point in this parable is all kinds of people are going to be attracted, okay? And all kinds of folks are going to be drawn in. And there are other passages that address the issue of how the church handles certain situations, sinful situations, let's say it that way. Church discipline, the leading of the eldership, etc. The Bible addresses those. This is just an in general statement of casting the gospel is like casting a big net, and a lot of different folks are going to be drawn in. God will take care of it in the end, there's no doubt about that. He's going to sever the wicked from among the just, verse 49. But the point being, just like the parable of the sower, there are different kinds of soil that are, 3 of the 4 were attracted to hearing the gospel, but 2 of them had no lasting devotion, let's say. And so this parable essentially is teaching the same thing here. Now, scattered between those 2 parables, look at verse 44. The kingdom of heaven is like unto a treasure hid in a field, the which when a man has found, he hides, and for joy goes and sells all that he hath, buyeth that field. Well, this is an individual's personal response to the gospel. He's found something of great value, and he'll do whatever he can to get it. And then you get to verses 45 and 46. A merchant man seeking goodly pearls, well, he finds one, and he'll do whatever he has to do to get it. At the end of verse 46. So we, as children of God, we have to have this proper conception of the church, of the kingdom, let's use the textual language here, that there is nothing more valuable than this. There is nothing more valuable in my life, or there shouldn't be, than the kingdom of heaven, than doing God's will. And I will sacrifice whatever I have to sacrifice to stay true to it. You know, you look at the history of sacrifice in the Bible, I mean, going all the way back to Cain and Abel, Genesis chapter 4, Abraham, the Levitical sacrifices. What was expected of the sacrifices that were offered? Was it the best? I mean, wasn't it the best? It was absolutely. It was the first fruits. It was animal sacrifice, and those animal sacrifices were extremely specific. It wasn't the leftovers. And the idea of sacrifice and commitment really go hand in hand. And value. If I understand that the kingdom of heaven is the most valuable thing in my life, I will sacrifice for it. So those parables and many others, obviously throughout Matthew 13 and the rest of the Gospels, talk about this. Any questions or comments on that before I go any further here? It's kind of laying some groundwork. Can't remember if we talked about this last week. I think we did, but two thoughts here. No person can have a Bible study for me. Did we talk about that one? Can't remember. I should have marked it. But anyway, no person can have a Bible study for me. Now, does that mean that if I can't do it, I shouldn't? Well, no. Maybe I should find somebody else to help me. Yes, definitely. I've had several of you over the years say, hey, listen, I've got so-and-so that wants to study. Will you meet with me? Will you help me? Will you go? That's really a good way to do it. You know, Jesus, you read Luke chapter 10, Jesus sent out 70 individuals and He sent them out 2 by 2. There's something to that. But we have to understand our responsibility. It's more, yes, I need to live a life that glorifies God. In fact, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10:33, whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. I need to live a life that other people can look at and emulate. And that's not arrogant. That's just doing what God would have you to do, knowing that you're doing what God would have you to do, with the knowledge that other people are watching. I'm not doing it for them in that sense. I know why I'm doing it, to glorify God, but I need to live that way. But just living that way is not all there is to it. Let's think about this one for just a minute. Earn the right to have a Bible study with someone. What do you think that means? Earn the right to have a Bible study with someone. A second. Well, that's true, but that's not the answer I'm looking for. What do you think it means to earn the right to have a Bible study with someone? They've got to know you care. There needs to be some type of relationship there. Door knocking. Door knocking is good in its place. I think your methods of reaching out to people vary from, I would say, from like location to location, where you live. Smaller towns, bigger cities. I think how you do these types of things, you need to have some wisdom behind how you do them. Let's say it that way. But if you just show up at somebody's door, they've never met you before, they don't know anything about you, and you say, hey, would you like to have a Bible study? They don't know where you go to church. They don't know what you believe. What is the probability that they'll, yeah, man, come on in? I mean, being realistic, not good. Not good. Most of the conversations that you have with people about the Bible are co-workers, people you know that you're with every day, family members, people like that. And so that's what I mean when I say earn the right to have a Bible study with someone. Now, that doesn't mean you can't say anything to people you don't know. It's not what I'm saying at all. But we need to have a balanced approach to what we're trying to do. Okay, let's do this. That kind of leads me into this next thought that I want us to discuss. Let's go to Galatians chapter 6. Do I have any questions or comments before I go on here? Mm. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And so to go along with what Reggie said, talking about an elder having a good report among those who are without, when you look at the quality, and we talked about this, we went through this series, several months ago, looking at the qualifications of elders and deacons and all of this. One of the points I made in that is, I think, important for us to understand. So since Reggie brought up elders, we'll just think about men for just a second, because biblically speaking, only men can serve as elders, because you have to be the husband of one wife. I mean, that's just one of the qualifications. But when you look at that list of qualifications for an elder, and then you think about, let's say, a man in a congregation who's a faithful Christian but has never been married. Okay? As a Christian man who has never been married, he can't serve as an elder because he doesn't have a wife and he hasn't raised up believing children. But what about every other qualification in the elders list? Would those not apply to him as well? Above reproach and knows the word and has a good report of those who are without. Those qualifications, I think, are something every Christian man should shoot for. Just because that's, what better way is there to be? But yeah, that's a good point. And that's part of earning the right to have a Bible study. All right, somebody read Galatians 6, verses 1 and 2, please. Okay, brethren, so we're talking about Christians here. The easy thing to do is just not get involved. If we see a brother or sister, let's say, doing or saying something they shouldn't, the easy thing to do is just to think to ourselves, you know what, they ought to know better. And I hope they change. And then just leave it. That's easy. Anybody can do that. But Christians are not called to do the easy things. And if we care about someone, so leave the spiritual realm for just a minute. If you see somebody doing something that's going to endanger their body, they're going to get hurt or possibly killed doing something, what would you probably do for that person? And this would even be for a stranger. You might say something. You think? Or you might take some action. You might see a small child that you don't even know walking towards a street. Well, they ought to know better. I hope they change their direction. That's not what you're going to do. That would be easier than putting forth effort to go after that kid, to at least say something. So that's what we're dealing with here in Galatians chapter 6, verses 1 and 2. But there's a qualification put here. Ye which are spiritual, restore such a one. So if you're not living up to the Christian standard, do you think somebody who has wandered away from the truth is going to listen to you? What might they say in return? Well, listen, you need to repent right along with me. They might have some ammunition against you. That's what it means to be above reproach. To be above reproach doesn't, and that's said of elders, that's said of deacons, that's said of every Christian. You read Titus chapter 2. But being above reproach doesn't mean you're sinlessly perfect. What it does mean is that people can't take a hold of your life and use it against you to call you out as a sinner. That's what that means. And I think even sometimes Christians have a misunderstanding of what it means to be without reproach. It's not sinless perfection. You have to be a spiritual person, spiritually minded. And I would say, obviously, living in accordance with that, you've got to restore such a one. The one who has been overtaken in a fault. Okay, so let me look at something here real quick. I want to look at this word fault. And that way we can have a clear understanding of what we're talking about. Okay. To fall by the wayside, a lapse or deviation. So you're on the word picture is you're on a path here and you start to wander off to either side. You know, how many times have we heard, we got to walk on the straight and narrow? Well, there's something to that because that's what Jesus taught. So this idea of a person who is overtaken in a fault, overtaken in a lapse, a sin, one of the definitions is a sin or a misdeed. This isn't, and here's a distinction that we need to be able to understand. This has nothing to do with my personal preferences of you and what you ought to do from my perspective. So many people get confused with this is the way I would do something as opposed to an actual sin. Doesn't the Bible talk about your conscience and not violating your own conscience in certain things? Now, there are things that are absolutely, and we know this, that are absolutely sinful, and you cannot do that as a Christian. And Paul says in Ephesians 5, there are some things that shouldn't even be named among Christians, that even the heathens are ashamed to talk about. So there are those things, those concrete things, but there's also this more abstract concept of the conscience. And we could talk about that in a variety of ways. That's not the point, though, right now. But don't confuse your personal preferences for something as a matter of sin. Okay? I think a very simple illustration here. There are folks in the religious world who believe that it's a sin to wear shorts of any kind. If you show anything above your ankle, that is immodest. What I'm going to need for that is what's called a book, chapter, and verse. You're going to have to show me biblically that it is a sin to wear cut-off pants. Now, can it become immodest? Yes, there's no question about that. But you cannot draw a hard line and say, like, well, going to play basketball. Typically those shorts are, maybe a little bit above the knee to right at the knee. Just depends on who's wearing them. There are some folks who would take the stance that all that's sinful. You're going to have to show me what law of God that violates. And you're going to have to specify it with Scripture. Don't confuse your preferences with what the Bible really says. And that's what a lot of people do. So it's not that they're overtaken in something that you wouldn't do. They're overtaken and they've actually committed a misdeed. Restore. To put something back that has been damaged into its original condition. That's what it means to restore something. Look at the end of verse 1. When you do that, when you take that effort, what are you supposed to do? According to the end of verse 1. Somebody read it. Consider thyself, lest you also be tempted. Okay? Bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. Part of living the Christian life is restoring the fallen. So many times when we talk about evangelism, we only talk about reaching out to as the word we used last week, the unchurched. That's part of it, absolutely. But just as much a part of that is reaching out to those who have been overtaken in a fault. Yes. And be turning over to James 5. But what Miss Sharon just said, and this has been my experience over the years, these are the hardest folks to win. I guess I would say I know why that is, but I don't really know why that is. I know why it is because a lot of times, it's like Hebrews 3:12. There's a warning in Hebrews 3:12 that you can become hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. Well, he's talking to Christians there. Christians can become more hardened against the truth than non-believers because they know better and they know they should be doing better. Yeah, the more you do it, the easier it gets. Yeah. Well, and we see that in society all the time. Okay, so right now, the big thing in one of the big things in our culture is transgenderism. If you say anything to push back against that narrative that a man can become a woman and a woman can become a man, if you say anything to the contrary, you're the bad guy, right? You're the crazy one. Well, and that's what people do in this scenario for Christians who have fallen away. You say something, you try to intervene, you're the bad, you need to mind your own business. Who do you think you are judging me? And it gets very defensive and things like that. But this goes back to what I said earlier. We are not called to do the easy things. Somebody read James 5, 19 and 20. Both of these, Galatians 6 and James 5, start out with the same word. All right, who started that? Go ahead.
Brethren, if anyone among you wanders from the truth, and someone turns him back, let him know that he who turns a sinner from the error of his ways will save a soul from death and cover a multitude of sins.
Okay, I've pointed this out to you before. So the King James says, if any of you err from the truth, E-R-R. The New King James says, if any of you wanders. The Greek word is plane. And it's a Greek word we get our English word planet from it. They used to look at the solar system and things were just kind of wandering around. There was no order, structure to it like we know there is now. That's the word he uses here. You're in the truth and then you just wander off into nothing. Okay? And one convert him. That word convert means to turn around. He that converts the what? Verse 20. Converts the what? The sinner. But who's he talking about here? Christians who have fallen away. A Christian who has fallen away is a sinner. And they need to be turned around. And you shall save a soul from death and shall hide a multitude of sins. That doesn't mean you're sweeping things under the rug. That's not what that means at all. Because when a person repents and asks God for forgiveness, what happens to those sins? They're taken away. Okay? So, what would we be willing to do for someone who has fallen away? You know, what amount of pushback, discomfort would we be willing to experience in an effort to bring back one who has been overtaken in a fault or one who has wandered away from the truth? Because the easiest thing to do is just not deal with it. Again, the easiest thing to do is say, well, they know better. They'll come back to church one day. Okay? Yeah. How do you, so here's a question, and I think you're exactly right. How do you get to that point where you understand, initially, the value of your own soul? But then, based on that, the value, the fact that everybody else's soul is worth just as much as yours is. How do you get there? Well, you going to say something? Yeah.
But with study and time, faith that all that is true, the faith that heaven is there, the promise is there, all that brings understanding of how important it is for, number one, your soul to be right, and then everyone else to be around.
Yeah. Has anything been done for you individually by God? I mean, for every one of us. And if we don't have a proper conception of that, of what He did for me, which in turn means He did it for everybody in here, you know, so we often cite John 3:16, God so loved the world. Yes. But that's a broad sweeping statement, isn't it? He did that for the world, absolutely. But He did it for me. And if I have that proper understanding that not only is that the case, but I'm made in the image of God, and that He came here and died for me, that I need to have that understanding about myself, and then I need to extend that to everybody around me. And if I have a brother or sister who's wandered off from the truth, and my method of addressing that is to not address that, then I don't think you have a proper conception of the value of a soul. You know, we often cite, what is it, Matthew 16:26? What shall a man give in exchange for his soul? There's nothing as valuable as one soul. That's why God sent His Son here to die. And if we don't have that if we don't have a grasp of that, then we're not going to try to reach out either to those who have, the unchurched, or those who have fallen away. We'll just have the opinion that I know better, they should know better, and maybe one day they'll come back. That's not proper. That's not a proper perspective on the value of a soul, but not just the value of a soul, my responsibility toward a lost soul, like these verses we're looking at here. Brethren, he's addressing all of us. If this happens, here's what you need to do. And so I think of Luke 15, the parable of the lost sheep, the parable of the lost coin, the parable of the prodigal son, and the parable of the elder brother. All four of those parables talk about this, about the concept of value and seeking out what was lost. Like there in one of the main points of the parable, we just call it the parable of the prodigal son, and that's part of it, but the other half is the parable of the elder brother who was jealous. The main point of that parable is the attitude of the father throughout the whole thing. Well, how do we apply that to our lives? Well, that's the purpose of the epistles. These letters written to churches lay out for us how we should function as a body and as individuals within that body. And I think Galatians 6 and James 5 are two passages that really drive this concept home. Any questions or comments on any of this? So let's conclude it like this. We just had 2 weeks together. Like I said, Kevin will be back next week. Any Christian can do this stuff. If this is not the work of sharing the gospel with the lost, the work of reaching out to a brother or sister who has fallen away, that's not the work of the clergy. This is the work of the Christian. And you guys know as well as I do that the religious world is often divided into clergy laity. You know, the highly educated, the seminarily trained pastor versus, you know, the common folk that sit in the pew. I think that's a very degrading view of what Christianity ought to be. But anyway, I hope we've talked about some things that have been helpful to you. And that's all I've got. Appreciate your attention.